Well, I'm hardwired to be an optimist, and I see great signs all around us. And I was going to start that way, but then there was that rally in Chicago, and then I just, which you probably know about, where we're seeing the ugly underside coming up to the surface, the worms, that crawl up. And then today, I just, driving here, saw that Ann Coulter has sent out this message that, yeah, we'll have immigration with us, but death squads tomorrow. Of course, Ann Coulter is Ann Coulter. She's just trying to sell herself in books, so you never know what they mean. But I wanted to begin with the period that we're living in, and then move back and see where Victor Serge fits in and why I think he's important. So we're, say, 15, 16 years into the new century, and I think at least maybe I'm old, and I feel like we're finally here in the 21st century. That I recognize there's something different now than the 20th century, and we're entering a new period, and hopefully a new epoch. And I think the Sanders campaign is very exciting, and just like the Jeremy Corbyn election to the leadership of the Labour Party in the UK, I don't care if I agree with them or not. I think it's important that they're bringing up socialism, bringing socialism to public discourse. And so I think it's a reflection of a new era in this country, if not the world. So you could say a generation and a half after the end of the Cold War, there's not much currency left for redbaiting in the United States. It's been tried, it backfires. We're going to see a lot more of it from here to November probably. But the majority of young people who are energized by Bernie Sanders have a favorable view of socialism, though they may not know what it is. And a majority of people think poorly of capitalism in the United States. That's amazing. And of course, Sanders' democratic socialism is not the revolutionary socialist democracy that was the goal of all of the non-Stalinist revolutionary struggles of the 20th century. But we have signs everywhere that the old order is crumbling and the new is trying to be born. So the question becomes, where does Victor Serge fit into all of this, and does he represent the old 20th century paradigms? I would say yes and no. He reacted to the experiences that he lived through, but he thought deeply about what would come next and recognized key features and always tried to remind us of what to hold dear. And he recognized, of course, the role that socialists and communists played in deepening democracy while struggling for socialist ideas. And he ended his life, I'm going to go through all of this in much greater detail, but saying we should all have a healthy distrust of centralized parties with guided ideologies. So then, where does he stand, and what did he say, and why do I think it's relevant? And you began by saying, who is Victor Serge, and that's how I always introduce this. Who was he, and why should we care? I've called him the Forgotten Marxist, the historian and the conscience of the left opposition, and I've insisted that he be rescued for the battles that we face now. He was granted the right to arrive on Mexican soil in September 1941. His journey to that final place took him through 7 countries, 3 revolutions, and 10 years in various captivities. He was born in one political exile in Belgium, and he died in another in Mexico. He lived from 1890 to 1947, so his life really covers that maelstrom of the momentous struggles of the first half of the 20th century. And most of his life was lived in material poverty. He knew real hunger, and his younger brother died of starvation. When I tell people that I write about Serge, invariably they tell me which books touched or influenced them the most. So I'm going to ask you guys, have you read anything of Victor Serge's? Yeah. What did you read?
Year 1.
Year 1.
Memoirs.
Memoirs. Eso, lo más importante, So this is what every revolutionary should know about repression. And so here's the way it usually goes. In the English-speaking world, most people know The Case of Comrade Tulayev, this dialectical novel of the purges, and or the memoirs, which I think is you should read if you haven't. And in France, it's usually that novel, If It's Midnight in the Century. Trotskyists usually mention his Revolutionary History Year 1, or From Lenin to Stalin. which he wrote in one 15-day stretch in 1936. But in Latin America, his most widely read book is the one that you just mentioned, studied by revolutionaries and reactionaries alike. It's his small pamphlet, What Every Revolutionary Should Know About Repression, and it was reissued by the French police in 1968 for the police force. But just to mention, Victor Serge conjures up this poetic, active expression of an era. He was with the revolutionary Marxists who refused to surrender to the Stalinist counter-revolution and who struggled so that their ideas would escape Stalin's attempt to exterminate them. He was no less implacably opposed to capitalism, and it's in this that makes his work so powerful. He was he's been called a poet, a bard, the journalist of the left opposition and the revolution, or the historian. But I'd say he's also the conscience of the revolution. He's remembered for the intellectual richness and moral insight he brought to our understanding of the significant historical struggles of our time, as well as for the principled revolutionary life that he exemplified. Anarchists, libertarians, revolutionary Marxists, socialists, all claim him as one of their own when they're not disparaging him for not being exactly one of their own. Although his relationship with the Trotskyist movement was contentious, he was the best-known Trotskyist of his time. And there was, today there's an amazing resurgence of interest in his books. And as you can see here, many of them are being republished. So how, more than a decade into the 21st century, can this work of this forgotten revolutionary have contemporary relevance? And as the 20th century drew to a close, the Soviet Union collapsed, and with its demise, the colossal battle of ideas that it provoked seemed to disappear almost from public discourse. So how can the struggles that and ideas that Serge represented, emerging from those titanic debates over the Russian Revolution and the society to which it gave birth, continue to resonate? In fact, interest in Serge's work, as I mentioned, is experiencing a stunning revival. And it started just as the Soviet Union was disintegrating. I would say today it's almost in renaissance. Every couple of years, like Trotsky's books about Trotsky too, there's a new crop of books and films, no films of Serge yet, even novels. But Serge's work is now being published or republished in many languages. And on the other hand, with the end of Stalinism, the victors, of the Cold War, proclaimed TINA, there is no alternative to Western-style capitalist democracy, even though since that time that the TINA came about with Thatcher and Reagan and then was again revived at the end of the Cold War, inequalities have continued to deepen. Everyday life and culture has been crassly commercialized. Democracy has been hollowed out. And in response, a new generation has taken to the streets demanding a better world and what's more, insisting that a better world is possible. So that, I think, is all sufficient introduction to want to go back and sift through the intellectual and political experience and even the disputes that existed in the prior century, and in doing so, you're struck. I was struck. I hope you would be too, by the voice and testimony of Victor Serge. And if you ever read the book, you'll see I quote so much from him because he's so eloquent. You know, just writing about him, you feel kind of inadequate. But his works address the paramount and unresolved issues of our day. And it's almost as if he was speaking directly to today's generation. He worried about how human beings could secure liberty, autonomy, and dignity. And he belonged to a revolutionary generation that sought to create a society sufficient to realize these goals. They failed, but Serge spent the rest of his life elucidating the attempt, analyzing the defeat, and seeking better ways to the same ends. So as I mentioned, his life spanned the first half of the 20th century, but his ideas, I think, are germane to the current debates today. And his contribution is especially attractive because he never compromised in his commitment to the creation of a society that defends human freedom, enhances human dignity, and improves the human condition. So for all those reasons, I think he belongs to our future. And because of that, I think he merits rescue. And that's really why I wrote the book. And so I want to go back now and look through his political journey. And to understand it, context is critical. As I mentioned, he was born in 1890. His parents were Russian revolutionary narodniks in the populist movement. His uncle was executed, shot by a firing squad or hung, I'm not remembering now, for taking part in the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. They were the individual anarchist populist terrorists of their time. And so when his uncle was executed, his parents fled with the young Victor Serge to Belgium. So he was not born in Russia, but he was born, he said, speaking Russian and in small apartments and houses where the walls were decorated with portraits of executed anarchists, and his house was a continual meeting place for those same ones. His father, I should just say, didn't believe in, he had nothing but contempt for the bourgeois education for the poor, so he never sent his kids to school, and instead took them through the libraries and museums and sometimes not of Europe, and that was the kind of education that he had. And at age 15, Serge joined the Belgian Young Socialists. He moved toward anarchism in disgust and impatience. The Belgian Social Democrats, he thought, were just opportunists, corrupt, and stuck in electoral politics. But more importantly, the year was 1905. And if you know anything about 1905, it's probably the most exciting year of the 20th century. Well, there was quite a lot of exciting years, but it was one of them. Because it saw the birth of the Wobblies, path-breaking discoveries like Einstein's theory of relativity, and gigantic struggles in the mass strike of Russia that Rosa Luxemburg wrote about, and of course the failed revolution. And that general strike in Russia spread to Finland. There were strike waves in France, Belgium, Germany, and beyond. And Serge, you know, as a very young 15-year-old with his young comrades, were animated by these struggles, and they thought that it put the reformism of the Belgian Social Democrats in an even more stark light. And they were attracted to the actions as well as the passions of the strikers in Petrograd and elsewhere. Looking at Belgium, Serge became disillusioned with the social democratic leaders, but he also became disillusioned with the masses who lacked the heroic militancy that he saw in Russia. So he and his friends moved, and he had a close group of comrades and brothers, and they moved toward individualist anarchism. And that was really an extension of his boyhood relationships and his commitment to liberty and action, as well as his disgust with stodgy social democratic misleaders of his time. But his early conviction, as I mentioned, was as an individualist anarchist, but he graduated and I think this is really important to understand, that anarchism pertained to a different time. Not like the anarchism of today, but it evolved, you know, as industrialization and the deepening of the working class did. But Serge moved with his friends from the individualist and even illegalist views to that of anarchosyndicalism. Just as a teeny little aside, because I can't do his whole biography, he participated in the famous Bande of Bonnot, the Bonnot gang. They were the Robin Hood of their time in France, and they were expropriating people for the cause. Serge never participated in their violence, but he edited their journal. And anyway, all of this period of his life, from socialism to anarcho-individualism to anarcho-syndicalism to Bolshevism, took place from 1909 to 1917. But by 1913, Serge was already thinking that anarchism was a dead end, but it took him another 5 years to get to Bolshevism. And he went to Spain in 1917. I don't know how many of you know, there was a uprising in Spain in 1917, and there he left behind his anarcho-individualism and participated in the syndicalist uprising. And there he changed his name from Victor Kibalchich, the name that he was born with, and took on the pen name of Victor Serge, and began his journey to his never-seen homeland, the Russia of Revolution. He never looked back. He didn't try some impossible mix of anarchism and Bolshevism. He became a Bolshevik and then a left oppositionist. And not only did he break with anarchism, but in 1918 he took it upon himself to try to persuade his anarchist comrades to support the Bolsheviks, as he now did. He found anarchism lacking. He said beginning with Bakunin, the anarchist movement was populated with a lot of authoritarian and intolerant characters. Democracy wasn't necessarily part of anarchism back then. They didn't recognize the need of large industrial organization or the importance of political power and social struggles or the complexity of social development and the impossibility of building an equitable and free society without passing through various phases of transition. So Serge liked anarchism, but he thought it was an idealist and completely utopian doctrine. Serge himself was a worker. He spent his entire life in poverty, as I said. He worked in print shops. You look at a lefty in the first half of the 20th century, and they all worked it. And they were linotype, copier editors, print shops. And he was a member of the Printers Union in Spain. He also worked as a copy editor and as a translator. He had no need to glorify the working class, nor did he hold back when he was disappointed in missed opportunities by the class. And as a writer, he committed to, and this is a quote, expressing to men what most of them live inwardly without being able to express as a means of communion, a testimony to the vast flow of life through us, whose essential aspects we must try to fix for the benefit of those who will come after us. His journey from black to red followed the momentous cleavages of the day: war, revolution, and civil war. He arrived in the Soviet Union in the frozen winter of January 1919, and that's year one of the Russian Revolution. And the country was already engulfed in civil war. And just, that the revolutionary ferment and excitement that he thought he was going to see was not exactly what he encountered when he got there. Although he immediately assessed the situation and chose sides. And he joined the revolution and the Bolsheviks, but he was already alarmed that the vibrant instruments of Soviet democracy were being shut down and the Bolsheviks were beginning to match the ferocious terror of the whites with some of their own. Totalitarianism, he said, didn't even exist as a word, but it was emergent in post-Civil War Russia. His eyes were wide open, and he sensed the dangers to come. He was torn by the distance between theory and reality, the growth of privilege and bureaucracy, and like Lenin and Trotsky, Serge understood the giant obstacles that stood in the way of socialist development in a backward Russia that was encircled by capitalist states. But he also understood that history provided few alternatives, so he wasn't a purist in this sense. He decided that Bolshevism was tremendously and visibly right. It marked a new departure, a new point of departure in history. Capitalism, they all thought, was finished, if not suicidal, after World War I. The interwar period was so unstable that the survival of civilization was in question if capitalism was not transformed. As I read that, I'm thinking about today. Anyway, yet in the young Soviet Union, the promises of revolution were being abandoned. And Serge wrote, "I thought of the revolution as a tremendous sacrifice that was required for the future's sake, and nothing seemed to be more essential than to sustain or rescue the spirit of liberty within it." He was 28 when he arrived in Petrograd in January 1919, a seasoned revolutionary anarchist who had already served 2 terms in prison and fought in the Spanish insurrection of 1917. As I said, he quickly joined the Bolsheviks because he thought they represented the unity of word and deed, unlike anything he'd ever seen anywhere else. There's lots of resolution-passing socialists, but the Bolsheviks were able to put it together. He said that they were revolutionaries who succeeded in putting their theory into practice. He began working on the first administrative staff of the Executive Committee of the Communist International, otherwise known as the Comintern. His many languages already at this time, French, Russian, and German, were put to good use. and he participated in the first 3 Congresses of the Comintern. He fought in the siege of Petrograd during the Civil War, and he served as commissar of the archives of the Okhrana, that's the secret police of the Tsar, and that's why he wrote that book after getting through those archives, and he said what every revolutionary needs to know about repression. He was then sent on Comintern assignment to Germany to Berlin to help prepare the German Revolution of 1923. And there he edited the French edition of Impricore, International Press Correspondence. They were big into acronyms. And that was the Comintern's main journal. After the defeat of the German October, Serge moved to Vienna, where he continued in Comintern work in the company of other exiles like Georgy Lukács, Antonio Gramsci, Adolf Joffe, and his old friend Angelika Balabanova, who was, you should read all of their memoirs if you haven't. And of this time, Serge wrote, "All we lived for was activity integrated into history. We were interchangeable. None of us had, in the bourgeois sense of the word, any personal existence. We changed our names, our posting, and our work at the party's need. We had just enough to live on without real material discomfort, and we were not interested in making money or following a career or producing a literary heritage or leaving a name behind us. We were interested solely in the difficult business of reaching socialism." In 1925, he then decided to go back to Russia or the Soviet Union to make his stand with the left opposition. And back in the USSR, I think that's where the Beatles got it. Serge earned his living translating the works of Lenin, Zinoviev, Trotsky, and others. He was one of the left opposition's main spokespersons in the Leningrad Party organization, and he was expelled from the party just after the 15th Party Congress in December of 1927, when Stalin moved against the left opposition en masse. 3 months later, he was arrested and held for 8 weeks. And then during the next 5 years of precarious liberty in the Soviet Union, Serge wrote and published abroad 5 books, including 3 novels and that year one of the Russian Revolution. Not one line of his works was ever published in the Soviet Union until 1989, and then only in the Urals, so it didn't make it to Moscow. And he also writes in the memoirs that the Stalinists stood over him as he translated Lenin to see if there was some counter-revolutionary positioning of commas and periods that might change, the meaning of Lenin's works. In 1933, he was arrested again and deported to Orenburg. It's a city straddling the border between Europe and Asia, near Kazakhstan, where for 3 years he and his son Vladdy, who became a revolutionary muralist in Mexico, nearly starved to death. He wrote 4 books there, all of them confiscated by the GPU, the Soviet secret police, when he was expelled from the country in April of 1936. And then once he was in the West, which is already a miracle that he got out, otherwise he would have been killed, Stalin stripped him of his nationality and his passport. European communists slandered him. Moscow used its considerable influence to prevent him from publishing in the mainstream press. And coming from exile in Orenburg and in the heart of the left opposition and internal deportation there, Serge spent his time in Paris in anguish as he witnessed Stalin's murderous campaign, which stretched from Moscow to Madrid. At least 19 members of Trotsky's family were killed, as was the whole revolutionary generation of old Bolsheviks in the purges, which wiped out millions. With Lev Sedov, Trotsky's son, in Paris, Serge began to unravel the labyrinth of madness, which was the purges, and try to analyze the nature of the social organism coming into being in the Soviet Union. This became his life's work. He was very close to Trotsky at this time, working as his translator, collaborator, and writing works such as Destiny of a Revolution. We call it 30 Years After here. That was the title in Britain. And that shared the overall perspective of the left opposition. He remained in Paris until the Nazi tanks arrived in 1940, and then fled with his family on foot, spending a frantic year in Marseille, waiting for a visa out of Vichy, France, hounded by Hitler's Gestapo and Stalin's NKVD. In Marseille, he and his son Vladdy were with a surrealist group of refugees collected by Varian Fry and Mary Jane Gold, an American heiress, who bankrolled their stay. She wrote a great book Crossroads Marseille that you should read because it really gives you a flavor of that time. And they found a villa outside Marseille that was called Air Belle, and Serge dubbed it Chateau Esper Visa, the chateau of waiting for a visa, which was named for the precious commodity that they were all looking for, a visa out of the nightmare. The fight to get him out of Europe was made much more difficult because of his Bolshevik past. Here in the United States, Dwight and Nancy MacDonald took him on as their pet project. It's probably the wrong way to say it, but they worked very hard to get him out. Julian Gorkin in Mexico worked feverishly to help him through the Emergency Rescue Committee. At one point, Serge was given a temporary transit visa, and he packed his bags. But then bureaucratic snafus resulted, and the bags boarded, but not the man. So once in the port in the United States, the Immigration Department confiscated Serge's 2 suitcases. The FBI assigned special agents to photograph the contents and translators to translate all the documents for his FBI file. And agents were then charged with writing summaries for the attention of J. Edgar Hoover. This was quite a surprise for me when I finally obtained his file, trying to struggle through a lot of the French stuff I see. They translated it badly, but you could read it. And then finally, a visa was procured for Serge, not to the United States, but to Mexico. His journey took him through Martinique, where he was detained, then through the Dominican Republic, where he was detained again in a concentration camp in Cuba, and finally landing in September 1941 on Mexican soil, his final exile. Mexico opened its doors to the vanquished survivors of the century's revolutions, and Serge, like Trotsky before him, found refuge there, spending the rest of his life writing what he thought was just for the desk drawer in the face of an almost total publisher's boycott. And then filled with plans for the future, Serge hailed a taxi one day in 1947 and died in the taxi in poverty. In fact, he had no identification on him. They didn't know who he was. And they buried him in a pauper's cemetery rather. His family later got him out, but it kind of just gives you his shoes had holes in them. His suit his fabric was threadbare. He was very poor. But his escape during the fall of France is charted in his novel, The Long Dusk. I don't know if any of you have read it. Some people pan it and they don't think it's very good. I loved it. It's really the stories of the beginning of the resistance, and it gives a lot of glimpses to his state of mind and his sardonic reflections on the role of intelligence taken in a Europe that was taken over by barbaric totalitarianisms, one fascist, the other Stalinist. He noted that with the far left remained the task of survival, the survival of thought and the survival of solidarity. This was his 4th exile and 7th flight in 20 years. He lived trying to maintain a shred of dignity in a twilight zone of illegality, hunted, harassed, and ignored. Being a man of the far left, he was shunned, he was excluded, and he lived exposed. And his political voyage brought him face to face with war, political isolation, and defeat. Near its end, when he was in Mexico, he devoted himself to intense writing and reflection. Isolated by geography, language, and politics, he expressed his deepest thoughts about the fate of socialism in the wake of Stalin's crimes in its name. By the way, his diary has now finally been recovered. When I was doing this research, I met his 3rd wife, but she had total disdain for him, and when I knew that she had a case of all of his letters because her daughter had told me, so I tried to get her to give it to me, and she kept going, he's not important, and so yeah. But then finally, a friend of mine who lives in Mexico with another guy kept persisting, and Laura Sejourné's 3rd wife, an anthropologist, died, and Serge's daughter, Jeanette Kibalchich, turned it over to them, and they've just published it about a year ago in French in a Belgian press, Carnet it's called, and New Left Review did a few excerpts from it was it a year or two ago? I can't remember, but these are just amazing. Little passages, day by day, reflections on everything. I won't go through them because you have to save yourself then. If you read French, because they're not translated not very many of them are translated into English. That's a new task. In any case, Serge was very clear about the nature of the communist parties, but he didn't have a viable organizational strategy. He thought the worst thing a genuine socialist left could do would be to remain inside a tiny left sect. Far better, he said, and you guys may not agree, to enter the old socialist parties where democratic practices would make it possible to have some influence, but he worried as well that the old opportunists would calmly let us be murdered by the Stalinists. And in 1947, he would write in Partisan Review that the old reformism is no less outmoded than insurrection. Socialist action is by definition neither exceptionally timid nor exceptionally violent, but it seems that it has to be both transformer and liberator or else disintegrate. He stressed that Stalinism and social democracy were inching toward each other and that the blindness of the social democrats towards this darkest of despotisms was unforgivable. So now I wanted to go back and take a couple of themes up, and you can let me know if I'm going on too long because I have. Fine. Okay. So when he arrived, going all the way back to 1919 in Petrograd, I mentioned he didn't see the revolutionary democratic ferment that he had anticipated, and instead the harsh reality of a frozen city trapped in the midst of counter-revolution, famine and disease, a growing monopoly of power exercised by the Bolsheviks. His perceptions thereafter differed in important ways from those of his Soviet comrades. He came to the Soviet Union from Western Europe. This is really important. He didn't grow up in the Russian tradition, even though he was, what we call, I guess, Belgo-Russian, but solidly Russian, just growing up in Belgium. And he was raised in the Russian anarcho-populist exile community and connected to anarchist, syndicalist, artistic, and literary circles, and he continued to associate once he got to Russia with non-party artists and writers in revolutionary Russia. So that's just to say that he didn't share the perspectives of so many of the Bolsheviks, and it gave him a lot of insight into things that they perhaps couldn't see. Also, I think this is very important, because he didn't grow up in the Bolshevik Party, he didn't share the party patriotism of many of his comrades. His critical sensibilities were a product of his experiences as both an outsider and an insider. A Russian raised in Western Europe with the experience in a broad spectrum of leftist thought and practice. He was with the Bolsheviks because they managed to actually function as revolutionaries at a time of revolution. In fact, that's what he said is the main characteristic of a leader, is to know, in a revolutionary situation, that this is the moment, and then what to do. He shared their democratic goals, and he was critical of their authoritarian practices. And this became his double duty, which is one of the main themes of his life. And for him, for Victor Serge, democracy was a defining component of socialism. And you mentioned that. I think that this is really one of the most important things that we can talk about today, about our movement for today. He didn't think of democracy as an accessory of the revolutionary process, but integral to it, indeed at the heart of the socialist project. The workers in Tsarist Russia created Soviets or councils, profoundly democratic organizational forms whose existence marked the health of a revolutionary process. In fact, for all of us, we always looked at whatever revolution was taking place and tried to see if there were Soviets or councils or something. And if not, well, it wasn't democratic and or healthy. And these institutions were key to the success of the revolution and the transition, and were to be the governing institutions of Soviet society. And revolutionaries like Serge from all over the world understood the power of the Soviets and saw in them the realization of our deepest hopes, he said, for a libertarian, democratic, truly tolerant and egalitarian form without the hypocrisy and flabbiness of bourgeois democracies. Yet these organs of genuine democratic control from below did not survive the measures forced by the dire conditions of the besieged revolution and civil war. It's also fair to say that the Bolshevik leadership had an underdeveloped commitment to them. I looked at this in 2005 when I went back and was trying to write about the appearance of the Soviets, and I was reading Trotsky and Lenin, and was kind of disappointed that they didn't see the same things in the Soviets that maybe we do. Serge called for the revitalization of the Soviets in substance, not just form. But the conditions that left the Bolsheviks isolated in power as well as in the world led to their developing party power rather than Soviet power. Not long after Lenin died, Stalin came to power, and he killed what remained of any hope for Soviet socialist democracy. Serge's critique of this process of political degeneration was at the core of all of his activities and writings, and that critique made Serge suspect. In some quarters, misunderstood and maligned in others. Social democrats and anarchists distanced themselves from him, as did the apologists, of course, of Stalinism. Although Serge had stood with Trotsky and the left opposition since 1923 and was the best known or most well-known Trotskyist among circles of intellectuals in the West, he was criticized by Trotsky and Trotskyists in the late 1930s for his differences over political issues and organizational practices. One, he sided with the POUM. He didn't see it as centrist. There's several other issues we can talk about if you like in the question time. But Serge, although he argued with Trotsky from within the anti-Stalinist left, we shouldn't let go of the fact that he was always an unrepentant revolutionary Marxist, and his perceptions put him at odds with his co-thinkers in the West, and it caused him much grief and isolated him from the very movement, the left opposition that he had devoted so many years to and at such risk. And I think reading through the debates and the arguments and the accusations of the time give us a sense of the desperate atmosphere, as well as the anguish that Serge felt as he witnessed Stalin's campaign of assassinations that spread from Moscow to Madrid. And you said detective. Well, I've been doing a lot of detective work now about spies in the left opposition, particularly one. And just as an aside, I went through and I read the Central Committee minutes of the Belgian and Dutch and French Trotskyist organizations, and I was shocked that in these minutes they were mostly concerned about who the agents were within them rather than talking about the conjuncture or what they were doing. Agent baiting is very poisonous. In any case, the small group of Trotskyists, exiles in Western Europe, were free to work and free to meet, yet there were agents in their midst, assassins marking their movements, and bitter denunciations and infighting, as I just said, among the increasingly isolated sectors of this left opposition. Pressed into Stalin's intelligence service were accomplished members of the creative intelligentsia, poets, writers, psychoanalysts, and anthropologists, making anyone and everyone suspect, including Serge. Though Serge was now out of the USSR, he wasn't free from Stalin's reach, and life in exile was very difficult. He was in constant peril. He was vilified in the Communist Party press. He was suspected at times by his own comrades, and he was caring for his sick wife, who was driven literally mad from all of the persecution. He was in a campaign along with Lev Sedov to refute the fantastic charges coming out of the Moscow trials. He was writing, he was translating, and he was really broke. And misinformation, deliberate distortions, and outright lies about what was happening in the Soviet Union were pervasive throughout the West. Concrete information was hard to find, especially about those who opposed Stalin's rule back in the Soviet Union. For this reason, I think it's really good to read his novels, because there's so many little glimpses of information for how the oppositionists cope, and you can read between the lines of the messages that were passed among them. The form is fiction, but Serge was a revolutionary witness who regularly and conscientiously recorded his memories. His testimonies and his ideas are not simply a time capsule from the front lines of history. His writings give us a real sense of the human and political dramas unfolding in their years in the way that is, in a way that's directly comprehensible. I always say if you read his work, you get a feel for the time in a way that you don't if you just read theoretical tracts, for example. And I think, maybe this is a group of pretty active political people who know a lot. But usually it seems, when I talk about Serge, people are surprised that Stalin concentrated such fury and zeal in hunting down this rather small number of Trotskyists and oppositionists who challenged his rule in organizations and far-left journals in the West in the late 1930s and 40s. This mighty effort to extinguish the small flames of defiance seemed disproportionate in view of the enormous tasks at hand, like the rise of Hitler, preparation for war. In fact, one of the things I did when I was looking this time for Zborowski files, I went to the Lubyanka, that famous place in Moscow, and I ended up getting an interview with an archivist, and he said they were embarrassed. The KGB was embarrassed about its own history of this period because they were forced to track down tiny groups of revolutionaries instead of looking at what was happening in the world at large, which gives you some understanding why Stalin was so unprepared when Hitler attacked and needed a couple of years. In any case, back to Serge, Marxist critics like Trotsky and Serge were not just a thorn in Stalin's side, but a moral reproach to his rule. Better to silence them and prevent their voice from finding large audience. Trotsky was assassinated in 1940. Serge survived and continued to wage the battle of the pen, his thinking now directed toward analyzing the features of the post-war world. Looking forward from the defeats inflicted by Stalinism, which threatened the idea of socialism itself, and by fascism, which had deeply damaged the working class movement, Serge called for a renewal of socialism if it were to remain relevant. Today we hear a lot about socialism, though given how far right the spectrum has moved, the call for left social democracy seems radical in the extreme. Serge's call, though, for a renewal of the kind of socialism with democratic self-governance at its heart is more urgent than ever. And do I have a little bit more time still? Okay. So if you review those issues that preoccupied him in these really dark years, there's a lot to reclaim for today, even though the context of his time is radically different from the present that we inhabit. He was writing during World War II and in the immediate post-war period before the Cold War began in earnest. He was deeply troubled by what he saw. Efficient bureaucratic machines with collectivist tendencies that completely choked democratic participation from below. His writings about these developments reflect a world that's long gone. Yet the tendencies that he noted and the questions that he asked are relevant. He, in fact, I think, proved prescient. If an historically conscious democratic collectivism did not successfully challenge the totalitarian collectivism of Stalinism and fascism, he said, it would mean the end of socialism on a world scale for a whole era. Serge held that the assumptions derived from the days of the Russian Revolution were no longer adequate. Writing in 1945, he observed that everything, science, production, social movements, and intellectual currents had changed. History permitted apparent stability only to religious dogma. An intellectual rearmament was necessary, and for that, a creative investigatory effort was required. As he noted, and this is a quote, "The poverty of traditional socialism coincides in reality with the immense revolutionary crisis of the modern world and puts unavoidably on the order of the day for all of humanity, independently of the action of socialism, the problem of a social reorganization oriented toward the rational and the just." He couldn't stress strongly enough that the socialist movement had to break free from its fossilized thinking, and that terrible new conditions demanded a fresh approach, dialectical thought, combined with political action. He called it a form of active humanism. He was fully justified, I think, in warning that continued adherence to the old patterns and formulas would bear grave consequences for the socialist movement. Much had changed, as I mentioned, since 1917. The actuality of the revolution, the fact that it happened, had emboldened workers in the West, radicalized by war, revolution, and the deepening capitalist crisis. Labor movements in the West were active, and communist parties grew in membership, supported financially by the Soviet Union. In their interwar period, the threat to capitalism's very survival was so great that Germany and Italy resorted to fascism. The New Deal in the United States was capitalism's response to a militant labor movement. using concessions to incorporate the working class rather than to try to crush it. And after World War II, welfare state reforms, including capitalist nationalization of key sectors of industries, especially in Europe, were accommodations to the threat represented by a radicalized working class and the continued existence of the Soviet Union. Stalinism, in the guise of Russian socialism, was degenerate and intolerant, Serge thought. European socialists were tainted by Stalinism, and he thought they couldn't see the roots of racism and anti-Semitism or the appeal of fascist reactionary nationalism, and they were weakened by their inattention to the changes brought about by the state and the economy by technological innovation. It was undeniable that the Soviet regime, fascism, Nazism, and the New Deal shared some common traits that reflected the collectivist tendencies of the modern economy. Trotsky in 1939 was also noting these similarities. The socialist movement, Serge said, needed intellectual rigor, an understanding of the political economy, and a living philosophy, which could point the way for workers to transcend bureaucratic statism if they were to achieve democratic control of society, organize a rational economy, and realize a higher dignity. In essence, he was saying socialism has to be current. It has to understand what's going on, and also has to understand discoveries in science, advances in understanding of human psychology. He had a correspondence with Erich Fromm. He was reading dabbling, you could say, in everything, including anthropology. But he said that Stalinism had retarded intellectual development with its state dogma, directed thought, and ownership of philosophical truth. The Marxist method of analysis and interpretation of history had been degraded as a consequence. Even on its own terra firma of political economy, European socialists had ignored the changes wrought by advances in technology that increased productivity but reduced the importance of manual labor. The developments in industry upset the traditional class proportions and relations, giving increased importance to governing bureaucracies as well as intermediary layers of administrators, technicians, managers, and intelligentsia of sociologists, economists, and psychologists. The existing analysis, in other words, Serge thought, of class struggle was too schematic, and it didn't take into account the role of the shareholders and tycoons or the civil employees of the totalitarian states. So you can see he was grappling with new uncertainties, and he was alone. Trotsky was dead, and he wasn't getting a lot of help from others. And he was frustrated by the inability of socialists to think creatively in their attempts to interpret the New World conjuncture. The Soviet Union represented a new force in the world that was neither capitalist nor socialist, but altered the nature of class struggle in the world. It was now an obstacle to socialism, Serge thought, and exerted a negative influence on all current struggles. We have yet to recover from the damage the Soviet Union has done to Marxism, but we could take heart in noting, I think, and I started with this, that the Redbaiting attempts in this campaign, trying to put a hammer and sickle on Bernie and make him into a Castro or a Chavez, have fallen flat, at least so far. We can see a time that calling oneself a socialist doesn't conjure images of a bureaucratic, authoritarian, blood-soaked society. For Serge's comrades, he wrote, it was sobering to realize that collectivism was not synonymous with socialism, as they had previously thought, and could in fact be anti-socialist, manifesting new forms of exploitation. For Serge, this revealed the extreme weakness of socialist movements and socialist thought. The defeats suffered in Europe were partly due to this theoretical as well as organizational debility. Lacking energy and foresight, the European socialists, Serge said, were brutally overtaken by events. He added, the subjective factor was not equal to the objective circumstances. That the socialists were not clearly aware of the dangers they faced nor of the opportunities offered to them. Likewise, the Bolsheviks were responsible in part for the march toward totalitarianism in the Soviet Union. He blamed their psychology, their ignorance of democratic values, and the methods they employed. The Bolsheviks compensated for their ideological insufficiency with will and authority, but also terror. American socialists like Sidney Hook, Dwight MacDonald, James Burnham, and others that he was in contact, and liberals were more concerned with freedom and liberty than their European counterparts, but Serge noted that their ideas were based on the ideals of bourgeois liberal humanism and traditions of parliamentary democracy. Honorable but out of date, he said, because the role of the state and its executive had increased so radically in the era of nationalized economies. On the other hand, the extended functions of the modern state, Serge thought, made obsolete the notion of the abolition of the state. The libertarian commune of the Bolsheviks, the commune states of the Bolsheviks in 1917 that was theorized in Lenin's State and Revolution went bankrupt, and the withering away of the state died during Lenin's lifetime. The Stalinist scourge nearly eradicated the notion that socialism is full democracy and rendered it equivalent in the popular mind with anti-democracy. For Serge, it was crucial to understand and to realize that wherever totalitarian communism prevails, nothing progressive will ever be done. On the contrary, we will see the stifling of thought and the strangulation of oppositions. That's a quote. There were grounds for optimism, he thought. The rebuilding of the European economy after the war would strengthen the working class, and the interdependence of nations could result in an internationalization of societies that Serge believed would promote the growth of socialist struggle. And at the same time, the totalitarian regime spawned a vigorous and deeply anti-totalitarian reaction. And no matter how tragically difficult the immediate situation was, socialism, he thought, might still have a great future in front of it. But the intellectual weakness of the socialist movement that was sapped of its energy by the formidable Stalinist machine could only be remedied by what he called an epoch of uprising. He misjudged the tendencies that he noted, believing the world was in transition away from capitalism to some form of statist bureaucracy. That clearly didn't happen. He was trying to define the characteristics of the world still in process of becoming, and he couldn't see past the period that he lived in. But unlike other thinkers of his time, Serge did not proclaim socialism a failure, but he called for its rebirth. Democracy must mean democracy at work and in the economy as a whole. Liberty must mean personal and political freedom. So, looking then, what can we salvage from his ideas and his writings, given that so much has changed? Well, one, the fact that a revolution took place, despite what it turned into, it changed the nature of the world. This was a transcendent experience. For a very brief time, another class was in power. And the influence of the revolution's promise was felt in the industrialized capitalist democracies. Important elements of the more advanced political democracy, such as universal franchise, representative democracy, free speech, and other basic rights, were won and conceded to in response to the existence of the Soviet Union and to contain radicalism at home. After 1918 and again after 1945, the radicalized working class demanded and gained social protections and democratic advances. The concessions provided a springboard for further demands. The democratic gains of the second half of the 20th century, brought by the labor, civil rights, and women's movements, significantly deepened democracy, leading to substantial changes in industrial democracies without appreciably deepening the struggle for economic democracy or workers' rights. But these reforms strengthened democracy, and democracy in turn brought the welfare state. Yet the latter cut into the profitability of capitalism at a time after 1973 that capitalism seemed increasingly stagnant. And with the disintegration of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, the increasing profit squeeze and competition from cheaper labor elsewhere, the concessions to social democracy seemed less necessary and increasingly difficult to deliver in an age of finance capital. So it's no surprise that the collapse of the Soviet Union hastened the decline of social democracy. And at the same time, the hollowing out of bourgeois democracy, which is perhaps nowhere more pronounced than the U.S. itself, was caricatured in the so-called new democracies of the former Soviet bloc. Today, we see a move toward increased authoritarianism and repression at the same time as this generation of millennials are demanding more genuine democracy, including measures to reverse the inequality that is a threat to their collective future. The protests of all of the squares and occupations were swiftly repressed here, although nowhere near on the scale of, say, Egypt, which is at the heart of the Arab Spring. But in Greece and Spain and Portugal, new left social democratic political parties emerged emerged, overtaking the traditional parties, but were unable to legislate an end to austerity, and we all know what happened in Greece. And everywhere the rule of money is transparently evident, and while we in the United States have the most rigid political structure, one that I thought was impervious to any outside party or change, we're now seeing challenges, both on the left and the right, to the continued status quo. We have, to bring us right up to the very moment, the poisoned water in Flint, the bankrupt school system in Detroit, decrepit infrastructure everywhere, while revenues serve as debt incurred from interest rate swaps for municipalities, and on a world scale, climate change tells us that what disaster capitalism has wrought. So we're living in an era of failed neoliberalism and anarchic chaos, ailing democratic parliamentary democracy, renewed, or at least out in the open, intolerance and racism, religious nationalism, but also renewed struggles for an undefined, better system. The promise of democracy is potent and it's risky, and as more and more people demand the genuine article, not the managed electoral shams that produce mostly the same results. Today, I think, and this is where I'm going to end it, the struggle for democracy is the direct fight for new forms of democratic decision-making, exercise from below. You said it in your intro, authentic democracy or control from below requires a sufficient level of understanding and education, and it's impossible if money has any influence in the process. And in many ways, this struggle for bottom-up democracy is a revolutionary struggle that involves coming up with better forms than the Soviets promised. We can't presume in advance what they're going to look like. The political form is always determined by the struggle itself, though without a high level of participation and control from below, substantive democracy remains but a dream. Just finally, the economic collapse of 2007 and 8, the inability to restore good jobs, and the threat of a life forever of precarious labor with little social support and a planet threatened by careless regard has given rise, as I mentioned, to religious, nationalist, terrorist, and populist forms. But it's also led to massive mobilizations of profoundly democratic social movements, toppling dictators in the Arab Middle East, protesting and striking an unjust economic system throughout Europe, occupying cities in the United States by the 99% against the financial elites who are blamed for drowning the population in debt while destroying their chances for a decent economic future. Disaffected by a politics that serves only the rich and the powerful, democracy is being reclaimed, though, through revived political protest against the ravages of capitalism. I don't think these demands constitute a call for socialism, but the protesters have put the elites on notice that they refuse to continue with the status quo. Repression's been swift, as we mentioned, but it has not suppressed the workers, students, unemployed, and foreclosed who continually invent new forms, including electoral forms, as I mentioned, that challenge existing parties. The social movements and protesters today lack the intellectual armor of the revolutionary generation of a century ago, but they share the hope that the economy and society can be organized to serve humanity and the community, and not the reverse. This human impulse for dignity, freedom, and self-organization cannot be repressed. It emerges over and over and over again, and it's cause for great hope. I would say that Serge's epoch of uprising is upon us. Thank you.